to do the homework than you would have to do for the quizzes.
Yeah. So I did it that way on purpose. I
Okay.
kind of made the quizzes due like every week, more or less.
Okay.
But the homework, I kind of give it until we have an exam on that section. You know what I mean? So those
Okay.
homework assignments are due at the exam. That's the way I've been doing it. But I can change stuff around. I'm
Oh,
open to
no. I was just
suggestions.
wondering. I wasn't sure why the homework was due before why the quizzes were due before the homework. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
But no, it's fine.
And the
I'm
quizzes are
making-
more like they're timed and everything, whereas the homework is usually kind of a longer thing. You have to go in multiple times and do a bunch of problems, that kind of thing,
Mm, yep.
right?
Okay.
All right. So the plan is here. Let me actually bring up our syllabus. But the plan is we're trying to stick to this plan as much as we can. So right, we're doing the cardiovascular system, the heart, and then the next chapter is the lymphatic system. So we're a little bit behind schedule, but not too bad. So my plan is to do the blood vessels today, the lecture on the blood vessels. And then when we come back, so I don't think we'll have class on Friday, right? I'm going to say, let's not do class on Friday. Let's everybody, take a couple of days off. That's why I was thinking maybe I'll schedule something on Monday so that we can go over anything with the blood vessels that we want to. And then Wednesday, we can start with the lymphatic system. That's my plan. And that will include doing the heart dissection this week sometime. So this week you'll have the cardiovascular or the blood vessels and then the heart dissection. So chapter 13. So 11, 12, and 13 all go together in my mind, right? 11's the blood, 12 is the heart, 13 is the blood vessels. We are going to do chapter 14 as well next week, and our test will be on those 4 chapters, which sounds like a lot, but they're all really so closely related. It's hard to separate them. So what we'll talk about today is the pathway of the blood vessels, some of the differences between them. And so we've already said when we talked about the blood flow through the heart that we have some blood vessels that are arteries and some that are veins. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood toward the heart. Always, always, always. So you can always be sure to remember that arteries carry blood away. They both start with A. And veins return blood to the heart. Now, the main reason that we are talking about the blood is that the blood is carrying oxygen, right? It has to carry oxygen and other nutrients to different parts of the body. The capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. When blood is in the capillaries is when things like oxygen can diffuse into and out of the blood vessels. So blood gets carried away from the heart by arteries, goes into smaller and smaller and smaller blood vessels. Eventually is in these tiny little capillaries where the blood can let go of oxygen and oxygen can get to our tissues. And then that deoxygenated blood flows back into gradually larger and larger blood vessels until it gets back to veins, which veins are just as big as arteries, and veins are returning the blood back to the heart to start all over again. Okay, so we have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Now, between arteries and capillaries, as the arteries get smaller and smaller, right, they become what are called arterioles. Arterioles are just little arteries. That's all they are, small arteries. And then when we go from capillaries to veins, we go from capillaries, which are tiny, to a little bit bigger, to eventually the biggest veins. The veins that are not quite as big are called venules. They're the same thing as veins, they're just a little bit smaller. So arterioles are small arteries, venules are small veins. All arteries and veins have 3 layers to them, right? The tunica just means layer. So the tunica intima, tunica media, tunica externa. Right? The intima is the innermost, the media is the middle, the externa is the outer. So all arteries, all veins have those 3 vessel walls. They all have those 3 layers in their vessel walls. The innermost layer is lined by endothelial cells. Okay, endothelium would be lining the inner layer of the blood vessels. The tunica media, the middle layer, is the layer that has a lot of smooth muscle. Okay, that's the layer that's controlling the diameter of the vessels. We'll see that the blood vessels can change diameter based on your blood pressure. Your body will actually make them either dilate or constrict. And that's the tunica media that your body's controlling. It's controlling those smooth muscles in there. And then the tunica externa is the external layer. It's basically a sheath of connective tissue around the vessel. So sometimes in some places in the body, it stabilizes the vessel or it anchors it, right? So it'll kind of attach the vessel to something else so that the vessel's not moving. And so these 3 layers are in all arteries and all veins, but there are differences between arteries and veins. The differences come from what they do, right? So here we talk about arteries. What are the differences in arteries? What's different about arteries than veins? Well, think about arteries. They're always carrying blood away from the heart. So they always have to deal with a much higher blood pressure than veins, right? The heart pumps, it pushes the blood directly into an artery. So that pump, that physical exertion pushing the blood is right there in the arteries. The arteries then travel all the way, to your feet, right, through capillaries, and then come back through veins back to your heart. By the time it gets to the veins, the blood has very little pressure in it. So arteries have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of blood pressure in them. And they do this by having a much greater wall thickness than veins. They have thick walls, right? It makes sense. You don't want the blood pressure to blow out the wall of the artery, so it has a very thick wall. Now, what that means is that the opening in the middle of the artery, which is called the lumen, so where the blood is smaller than in veins, right? If you think about it, they're both the same size on the outside, but if the artery wall is a lot thicker, the opening in the middle is going to be smaller because more of that space is taken up with the muscle that makes up the wall. They also have the thicker tunica media, so the middle layer is much thicker, which allows the body to either constrict or dilate the blood vessels. So all of these things about arteries have to do with them dealing with large amounts of pressure. So here you can see a comparison of an artery and a vein. Generally in your body, wherever you have an artery, you have a vein running right next to it, right? Because the artery is bringing blood from the heart to that area of the body. The vein is bringing it back to the heart. So it's really common to be able to see an artery and a vein like this right next to each other. Now you can see very easily that the thickness of the wall of the artery, which is actually the tunica media, is much thicker than it is in the vein, right? But the opening, the middle of the artery, the lumen, which is where the blood is going to be smaller than that in the vein. Okay, so arteries tend to be kind of round. They have a lot stronger structure. They're a lot thicker. Veins sometimes can even collapse, right? Veins they don't have a lot of smooth muscle in the lining. So if you're looking at an artery and a vein, you should be able to pick out which is which pretty easily. The largest arteries, the first ones leaving the heart, are called elastic arteries. So these are kind of the major arteries, the biggest ones coming off of the heart. They have more elastic fibers than smooth muscle fibers. So they're very resilient, right? They can stretch. So as the heart beats, you get those pulses of pressure. These arteries can stretch and accommodate those amounts of pressure. So they can recoil, right? They can stretch and stretch back. That's why they're elastic arteries. The next arteries, as we get further away from the heart, are muscular. These are kind of the medium-sized arteries. And they're still pretty big, right? They're distributing blood to different muscles and different organs. They have a lot more smooth muscle in them, right? They have a high proportion of smooth muscle. They have less elastic fibers, so they have less of a need to stretch and recoil, and more of a need to basically change whether they're dilated or constricted based on your needs, your body's needs. Then we get to the smallest arteries, which are arterioles, where in the arterioles, the tunica media only has a couple of layers of smooth muscle. So the internal diameter is a little bit bigger in comparison, but these are smaller vessels. And the diameter changes in response to various stimuli. So just like the medium-sized arteries, if you have things like low oxygen level, it can alter the diameter of these arterioles to change the blood pressure and the blood flow. And we'll see that. Then we get to capillaries, the smallest blood vessels. Right, so we're going away from the heart. We go through elastic arteries, then we go through muscular arteries, then arterioles, then capillaries. Capillaries are the only blood vessels whose walls allow exchange between blood and interstitial fluid. They're only made of a tunica interna. They don't have 3 layers like the arteries do. They only have that innermost layer, which is only endothelial cells. Right? And there's space between the endothelial cells, basically. And that allows for diffusion. It allows for things to get into or out of the blood vessels. Right? So they're the smallest, not only the smallest in diameter, but they only have 1 cell layer, right? They don't have these 3 layers of cells. They only have the 1 cell layer, so that things can get in and out of the capillaries. Now, there are an enormous number of capillaries throughout the body, right? You have these beds of capillaries throughout your body that allow for a lot of diffusion of nutrients and oxygen and carbon dioxide. So you don't just have an artery, an arteriole, and 1 capillary. The arteriole branches into what's called a capillary bed. So it might be 10 or 12 capillaries that branch from an arteriole. And it allows for oxygen and nutrients to get into a lot more areas of your body, right? Where the arteriole meets the capillary, where it meets that capillary bed, there's a little muscle, and that's called the precapillary sphincter. Right, the muscle is just before the arteriole, right where the arteriole meets the capillary, so just before the capillary. And basically, it's just a ring of smooth muscle, and your body can either relax it to allow increased flow into that capillary bed, or constrict it to decrease the flow of blood into that capillary bed. And so here's a better picture of it. Right? This capillary on the left in red, this blood vessel on the left in red is an arteriole, the smallest of the arteries. On the right is a venule, the smallest of the veins. Between them is a bunch of capillaries, right? So you don't just have 1 capillary between the artery, or the arteriole and the venule. You have a capillary bed. Now they're showing a sphincter right here. This is a precapillary sphincter. So if your body did not want to send as much blood flow to that area, your body could constrict this sphincter and not as much blood would get into that capillary bed. The opposite is true as well. It can relax that sphincter and allow more blood into that capillary bed. So your body does this. You only have a certain amount of blood in your body, of about 10 pints of blood. And so where you need the blood the most, your body will shuttle that blood to that area. For example, if you're running, right, you need more blood going to your legs so that you can get more oxygen to the muscles of your legs. So what will happen is the precapillary sphincters and the capillary beds in your legs will relax to allow more blood to come in. At the same time, you don't need to worry about digesting a meal. So what will happen is the precapillary sphincters to the beds that are part of the intestines or around the intestines will actually constrict, right, and limit the blood flow to those areas. So your body is picking and choosing where to send the blood as you need it.
Sorry.
There are also alternate routes for blood flow. And anastomosis is basically an alternate route. It's kind of a redundant route. So a lot of times blood vessels join each other and they form these anastomoses. They form these, there's redundancy. There's multiple small blood vessels going to the same area. There are a couple different kinds that they mention by name. They mention an arteriovenous anastomosis. So from the first word here, you can see that it goes from the arteriole to the venule, right? Arteriovenous. This bypasses the capillary bed, connecting the arteriole to the venule. So I'm just going to flip back to this one. If this precapillary sphincter is closed, if it's constricted so that blood can't get in there, the blood can come through this arteriole, head through this anastomosis, this alternate route, to get back to the venule, to go back to the heart. Okay, it's not going through the capillary bed. This is not a capillary, right? This doesn't have as thin of a wall of capillaries. So blood, oxygen can't get out of here, right? So it's just, you're not moving any nutrients this way. You're just actually moving the blood from the arteriole to the venule. There are plenty of arterial anastomoses. Those occur when arteries fuse before branching into arterioles. This ensures delivery of blood to capillary beds of key areas such as your brain and your heart. Basically, it's redundancy. It's saying that you have multiple arteries carrying blood to your head or to your brain and to your heart, so that if blood isn't getting through one of those routes, it's at least getting through some of those routes, right? So if you have 5 different routes and one of them's blocked up, but at least you can get through those other 4 routes, then you're still getting blood to that area of the body. So because the heart and the brain are such key areas of the body that need blood, that need oxygen, there are multiple routes going to those areas of the body. Then we go from the heart to elastic arteries, to muscular arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries. Then we get from capillaries to venules. Venules and veins collect blood from tissues and organs and return it to the heart, to bring it back to the heart. The size of them basically classifies whether they're considered a venule, medium-sized vein, or a large vein. So that means that they're all the same. Venules, medium-sized veins, and large veins all have the same 3 layers. They have the tunica intima, the tunica media, the tunica externa. Biggest difference is just the size of them. The venules are the smallest, and the smallest venules don't even have a middle layer. They don't have a tunica media. The medium-sized veins are a little bit bigger, and they have a few layers of smooth muscle. And the large veins, right, you have a thin tunica media comparatively compared to the arteries, surrounded by a thick tunica externa. So these would be things like your vena cava, right? The large veins that bring blood back to the heart. So we said arteries have certain features in order to allow for blood which is under high pressure to exist in the arteries. Veins have a different problem. By the time the heart pumps, it pushes the blood down to your foot, and it goes through arterioles and through capillary beds in your foot. And then it gets back to venules and veins in your foot and your lower leg, and it has to come back up to your heart. There's very little pressure in the blood vessels that are the vein, right? You've exerted that blood pressure through the arteries and the arterioles. By the time you get to the capillaries and the venules, there's very little pressure. So veins have the problem of returning blood to the heart when there's little pressure. There's not very much pushing the blood there. And, to make it even tougher, most of these veins are working against gravity, right? All of your veins that are below your heart, which is probably 2/3 of your body, are working against gravity, and there's not really any blood pressure pushing that blood towards your heart. So veins, again, they have relatively thin walls because they don't have high blood pressure in them, but they also have these medium-sized veins in your limbs, in particular, contain valves. So in your arms and your legs, they prevent backflow of blood. so that at least if you get the vein to push the blood like to the next section of or you get the blood to go to the next section of the vein, there's a valve so that it won't sink back down to the previous section. If you see people with like varicose veins, what happens is their valves are distended, so the blood's sitting against those valves, and that's why they become kind of bulging, and you get those lines. A lot of people get varicose veins in their legs. And so what veins do, what they take advantage of with these valves, are skeletal muscles. So here you can see a diagram of a vein coming up from the foot. So the blood would be having to go from the heel all the way up to the heart. And whether you're standing or sitting, it's working against gravity, and there's not very much pressure in there. But the veins have this situation that they use to their advantage. The veins are running through areas where they have skeletal muscle on both sides. So this is your calf muscle, right, on both sides of this vein. Now, whenever you're moving around, your calf muscles contract. And when they contract, they push against that vein, right? And so they're going to smush that vein and push the blood in both directions. But veins have these valves, right? There's a valve right here. So this valve is closed. So now when the muscles squish the vein, blood can only move through the open valve. It can only go one way, right? So the blood, so here they're showing as you take a step, the muscle is going to kind of pinch that vein and push the blood like one notch closer to the heart, right? It's going to move up past the next valve, and then hopefully another muscle will contract and help you move the blood eventually back to the heart. Now, this is why they tell you, this is why doctors will say if you're on a long flight or if you have a desk job where you sit for long periods of time, get up and walk around, right? It's good for you. It's good for your heart, is what they tell you, right? Well, this is the biggest reason that it's good for you. If you know anybody that's in a hospital, or, Kristen, I know you work at a facility, you probably have cuffs on some of these people's legs, right? The people that are bedridden, they put these special cuffs on their legs, and the cuffs constrict the muscles in their legs every so often, whatever it is, every couple of seconds. And what that's doing is it's stimulating the movement of this blood so that the blood goes back to the heart, so it doesn't pool in the legs, right? What can happen if you don't do that is that you get what are called DVTs, deep vein thromboses. And what'll happen is the blood will start pooling in one of these veins. Now, these veins are pretty big, so you probably won't get the blood to completely block off one of those veins. But you get pooling of blood so that like a clot forms. Then when you get up and move, that clot breaks free. And now that clot is traveling through your bloodstream, and it can get lodged in a much smaller vessel. And usually, if you get a thrombosis, which is a clot in your leg, and it gets dislodged, usually it ends up going to your lungs, right? Because the capillaries surrounding your lungs are much smaller blood vessels, and it usually becomes what's called a pulmonary embolism, right? That's how this can lead to a pulmonary embolism, is that if you're not using your skeletal muscles, blood starts to clot in your legs. It ends up forming a thrombus, which is a little blood clot. When you do move, that blood clot moves through your blood vessels, and it gets lodged in a smaller blood vessel, right? The next smaller blood, it's going to go through your heart just fine, because these are all big veins going back to your heart. But then it's going to get lodged in one of those arteries going to your lungs, right? And it's going to cause a thrombosis in one of the capillaries of your lungs. So you're going to be limited in how much oxygen you're getting into your blood vessels. And so here's just a comparison chart of veins and arteries. Again, you can see they're about the same size on the outside, but because the artery is thicker, the lumen, the interior part, is smaller than the vein. But you can see medium veins and medium muscular arteries, which are medium arteries, venules and arterioles, and then the capillaries are the smallest. Remember, the capillaries only have a tunica intima. All these other blood vessels have 3 layers. So we've talked about the arteries and the veins. So how do we regulate perfusion? Well, perfusion is just how much blood you get to a certain tissue or a certain part of the body, right? And it has to be regulated, obviously. And so there are different things that affect that perfusion, right? There's cardiac output. So how much blood is getting out of your heart, right? When your heart beats, how much blood are you pumping? There's peripheral resistance. As the blood gets further away from your heart, right, resistance builds up. There's friction, basically. So the longer that distance is that it travels, it's going to encounter more and more friction, and that's going to affect how those tissues get filled or perfused with blood. And then blood pressure is going to affect things as well, right? How much physical pressure is your heart exerting on that blood? Your goal is to ensure blood flow changes occur at the appropriate time and in the right location without drastically altering pressure and flow to vital organs. So your body is going to constantly shift where perfusion is happening more based on your body's demands. And the goal is to never have that affect, blood going to your heart or your brain or some of the other vital organs of your body, because that's going to affect, other processes. And so this is accomplished through autoregulation, neural processes, and endocrine processes. So some of this is just autoregulation. We'll see that blood vessels, for instance, can change diameter based on blood pressure. And that's just a system within the blood vessels. There's no control from your brain necessarily. There are situations where there are neural processes that control these things. There are signals from your brain that will control some of these processes. And there are some hormones that will affect these processes as well. So autoregulation, right? The first thing that can affect these processes. Autoregulation is just means that something is happening in the actual blood vessels. They're not getting a signal from anywhere else. So these are adjustments in blood flow made by precapillary sphincters. What's happening is those sphincters just before the right where the arteriole meets the capillary can actually constrict or dilate. And that is just based on things that are actually in the blood, right? So there are vasodilators that promote the dilation of precapillary sphincters and increase blood flow. So if you have low oxygen in your blood or high CO2 in your blood, right? You want to open up those sphincters and get more blood flow. You want to get more oxygen or get rid of more CO2. Histamine happens to be a vasodilator as well, and nitric oxide, and that has a role in DNA. But the vasoconstrictors do just the opposite. They're the things that stimulate constriction of those sphincters and decrease the blood flow. So those would be, either high oxygen or low CO2 would constrict your blood flow. If homeostasis is not restored with this simple little autoregulation mechanism, then neural and endocrine processes can be activated. So your body is hoping to just be able to rely on this and make enough changes that it makes a difference. But if not, there are signals from your brain and there are hormones that will constitute a bigger change. So when we get to neural control, the brain's control, there is what's called the cardiovascular center in your medulla oblongata. So your medulla oblongata is part of your brainstem, right at the back of your brain. And this has a lot to do with your cardio center, cardiovascular center. So how fast your heart is beating, that sort of thing. This responds to changes in arterial pressure or blood gas levels to maintain adequate blood flow. So there is an acceleratory center and an inhibitory center, right? So it can either accelerate your heartbeat or slow down, inhibit your heartbeat. And the acceleratory one those are sympathetic nerves. The inhibitory one activates parasympathetic nerves. Keep going, hopefully this will work. All right, so the vasomotor center, right, controls diameter of the arterioles and peripheral resistance. So this cardiovascular center is controlling your heart rate. right? The vasomotor center is controlling the diameter of the arterioles. Sympathetic stimulation causes vasoconstriction, and that will actually increase your blood pressure, right? If you make the blood vessels smaller, there's going to be more pressure going through them. So this would cause an increase in peripheral resistance and blood pressure. And the cardiovascular center is detecting changes in demand, and it's monitoring things like blood pressure, pH, and gas concentrations. So there are, in this cardiovascular center, there are two types of reflexes, or really sensors, to determine the cardiovascular rate. One set are the baroreceptors, which respond to changes in blood pressure. Baro, I always think of barometer, which changes pressure. And there are chemoreflexes, which respond to changes in chemical composition. The baroreceptors are found in your carotid sinuses and your aortic arch. So your carotids are the blood vessels that are going to your head and neck, right? Your aortic arch is just above your heart. So the baroreceptors are monitoring the pressure right near your heart. So it's pretty close to monitoring your heart's blood pressure, right? These are the vessels right after it's leaving your heart. They're basically just monitoring how much those vessels stretch. Remember, those are the vessels that can stretch to accommodate that blood pressure. And so the reflex is that if there's increased blood pressure, if these baroreceptors sense that there's increased blood pressure, right, they will inhibit your cardio-acceleratory center and stimulate your cardio-inhibitory center. If there's increased blood pressure, they're going to slow your heart rate down, right? And it's inhibiting this vasomotor center. So it's doing things to slow your heart rate down. The result is that you're decreasing your cardiac output. If you're slowing down your heart rate, you're not putting out as much blood per minute, right? There is widespread peripheral vasodilation. What's happening is you're dilating your blood vessels to make the pressure go down in your blood vessels. And those two events can combined lower the blood pressure, right? And so if they sense decreased blood pressure, they do just the opposite. They start accelerating your heart rate, right? And they will constrict your blood vessels, and that'll try to get your blood pressure up. The atrial baroreceptors monitor blood at the end of the systemic circuit. These are in the vena cava, right where it comes back to your right atrium. And atrial reflex occurs in response to stretching the wall of the right atrium. So this stimulates the cardio-acceleratory center. If the blood coming back into the right atrium is coming back in such big amounts that it's stretching the right atrium, it's going to stimulate the cardio-acceleratory center to try to return that atrial pressure back to normal. Right. And here is just a summary of the baroreceptor reflexes and of the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch. Now I'm going to go through chemoreceptors, and then we'll get off and get back on. Chemoreceptors, the beginning of the word chemo means chemical. So chemoreceptors, baroreceptors were sensing pressure changes. Chemoreceptors are looking at chemical changes. And so they're looking at changes in things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and the pH of your blood. And those are located in your carotids and your aortic bodies, right? They're activated by either a decrease in pH, a decrease in oxygen, or an increase in carbon dioxide. These receptors can stimulate the cardio-acceleratory and vasomotor centers. So if you have less oxygen or more CO2, or your blood has a low pH, it's getting acidic, what's going to happen is you are going to stimulate your heart rate, right? You're going to increase atrial pressure and blood flow. You're going to do all those things to increase your heart rate, to increase the blood flow. These respiratory centers also are linked to your, the cardiovascular centers, or this chemoreceptor reflex, is also linked to your respiratory center. So at the same time, it's going to increase your respiratory rate. which makes sense. If you have high CO2, you want to increase that rate of respiration and get rid of that CO2. If you have low oxygen, you want to get more oxygen in. All right, so I'm going to stop right there because it's kicking me off. Let's stop there and get right back on with the same link, and we will finish